Good day, everybody. This is Jim Ransom with Morning Jim Poetry. Um, I think this is the first of many dozens of sessions where I got the name right. But today we are going to read some poetry from the Bible, which is a gigantic book containing many poems, although most people do not think of the Bible as a book of poetry. For all intents and purposes, it really is. Starting with the Old Testament and continuing through into the New Testament. I know we all realize that the Psalms from the Old Testament are considered to be songs and poems. In fact, the word psalm in Hebrew means song. Written by various scribes, it was, and priests and prophets. Some of these are attributed to King David, since the education required to write in Hebrew was rather limited at that time. And David is, we are told, was a young man of good family, but not necessarily a highly educated one. He's better known for downing Goliath with his sling and stone. But it is amazing, again, that we have so much literature from a society that had so few literate people in it. Here are two of my favorite Old Testament psalms or poems. One is not a psalm. And it's from my dear late aunt's Bible, which is a revised standard version from 1952. And it's Psalm 23, titled A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's a beautiful bit of poetry, and regardless of whether you read this version of it or the version that is in the King James translation of the Bible, they're both absolutely beautiful. The 1952 version is a little cleaner in modern English and perhaps easier for many people to understand. I would like to go ahead with some more poetry from the Old Testament. Some say that at least a third of the Old Testament is poetry, and perhaps in the book of Isaiah, it's really more like half of the book of Isaiah. There are poems that are that intervene after segments of prose text in which Isaiah tells you some of the stories, especially about King Hezekiah, who was the king of Judah at that time. Now, this will be a familiar poem to many of you. It's in Isaiah 40, And I'm going to disregard the first 6 or so lines and start with what I think is the most beautiful part of the poetry. A voice cries in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord. Make it straight in the desert, a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low, and uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, 'Cry,' and I said, 'What shall I cry?' All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades. When the breath of the Lord blows upon it, surely the people is grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Get you up on to a high mountain. O Zion, herald of good things, lift up your voice with strength. O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings, lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. Now, there's a lot more to that, but I think you can get a sense of the poetry there. And remember that Hebrew poetry in the Old Testament did not rhyme. It was not rhyming poetry. Rhyming poetry started with the Greeks and Romans and moved on to the Italians and the English and those sorts of people that have led up to the present day. So Job, the book of Job, of course, is very poetic. And usually the poetic passages in the Revised Standard Bible are laid out as free verse and interspersed again with prose segments like in the book of Isaiah. Exactly how they all fit together is not always clear, but perhaps theologians know, and I'm not one of them. But I think a better explanation is that most of these books were probably not written by one person in a very finite era. They were probably written by groups of highly educated priests and people following one on the other and returning to the same work and improving on it. We just don't really know, but that's kind of what it sounds like. When we turn, as we will do here in a moment, to the New Testament, we don't expect to find poetry, but it is there. It's all over the place. If you look at a modern translation of the Bible, you will see that right in the text of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, that there is what I call a sermon portion, and it's pure poetry. And it was written, I think, as poetry, and I was able to transcribe it unchanged into quotations and quatrains of unrhymed verse without changing a single word or a punctuation mark. And I read this poem and at a previous session over a year ago, and it's called the poetry, I called it the poetry of Paul. And when you hear it, you will know, because if you're a Christian and you've had some exposure to the Bible in Sunday school or church classes, you'll recognize it right away. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecy, it will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For our knowledge is imperfect, and our prophecy is imperfect. But when the perfect comes, the imperfect will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood. So faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. As I say, I was able to put that into a poem of quatrains, which is 4 lines per, as 3 lines, not quatrains, but 3 lines per segment of the poem, per section. And I didn't need to change a single punctuation mark. And I think it's very amazing. After I did that, I read a few months ago of a new translation of the plays of Aristophanes. It was a review, I think it was in the review section of the Wall Street Journal, which is present on weekends. And the author of that review said that the reason that Aristophanes sounds so contemporary is because how smoothly ancient Greek translates into modern English. That was an insight, a new insight for me. I did not know that. I think that miracle is at work in this wonderful poem. It's also a beautiful poem in the King James version of the Bible, but it's a little harder for young people to understand, I think, because the English is off from modern English. For example, I think a beautiful line from the King James version is where it says, I gave up childish ways, for now we see in a mirror dimly. And in that version it said, now we see in a glass darkly. Now that's a little confusing to the modern reader who doesn't realize that in the 17th or 16th century, a mirror was called a glass in English, and if you saw through a glass darkly, it meant you were seeing in a mirror dimly. I think it's much more clear to the modern reader, although I learned it through a glass darkly, and I've always thought that was an absolutely beautiful piece of wordmanship, piece of poetry. A comment about Paul, or St. Paul if you prefer. He was a real intellectual in his time. He spoke Aramaic and Greek and Latin and could read Hebrew and perhaps some other lost languages of his time. Thus, he was much better educated than the original disciples of Christ. He could write in both Greek and Latin. These talents, along with the miracle of his conversion, made him without doubt the most effective Christian missionary of all time. In fact, there have been some scholars who have said that we should call Christianity Paulism because Paul had so much to do with the modern presentation of the religion. I have no comment on that. But I do like the writing of Paul. He was a great writer, a great converter of the heathen, and also, as we have just seen, an excellent poet. That's all for this week. Next week will be completely different and will feature some of the poetry of Louis MacNeice, among other things. I hope you can be there. Bye now.